Hey, it's Phil, and welcome on the Habit Bootcamp's podcast where I interview entrepreneurs and coaches about their mindset shifts and habits. In this week's episode, I interviewed Tilo Flache, who is a decluttering coach. And we talked about the value of organization and cleaning up. We give some great study and learning advice. We talked about how to discover the signs of a burnout and how to deal with it. And we talked about the magic of tantra. So we talked about a lot of interesting topics. Let me know what lesson you've gotten out of this podcast and enjoy this week's episode. Hey Tilo, welcome on the podcast, man. Welcome on my couch.
Hi Phil, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to sit down with the Cluttermeister and the master in decluttering, like cleaning up things and really make it organized.
Wow.
When did you first become interested in organization and decluttering?
I think I always was. I wouldn't describe myself as OCD, but I think I always had a healthy respect for organization. And I think it's really down to feeling it's more practical. I just don't like looking for stuff all the time. I'd rather have it where it needs to go and have enough space to put it there and not keep stuff that I don't need. And I think that was pretty much something I've brought with me from when I was this tall.
Really? So there wasn't something like, when are you gonna clean up your room, that a lot of children don't do and a lot of parents complain about?
No, actually my room was pretty clean to start with. I didn't really have that much. My family wasn't rich, and I did have toys, yes, but I also had a lot of storage in my room, so there wasn't much space. So in order to be able to get anything done, doing my homework or playing properly, I had to move things out of the way, which means that everything went into the cupboard after I used it.
What did you explore and discover mostly?
I think one of the things I discovered was interpersonal relationships. And I'm not talking about romantic relationships or anything like this, but just getting to learn how to deal with people, because I didn't at home. My dad passed away when I was in my early puberty, early teens, and my mom wasn't really that present. So I did pretty much everything on my own. And going to study somewhere else gave me the opportunity to interact with other people. And people I hadn't met before, I didn't know since I was 5. So that was quite a learning experience. And I think that had a big influence on me. It changed how I think. It changed how I behave. But I was also seriously limited by lack of emotional grounding in my teens. There was a disconnect, and that disconnect kept going until about 5 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. So it kept going for more than 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did I can imagine that losing your dad at such a young age had a big influence or impact on your life?
Well, it did, especially since my dad was the emotional anchor of the family. He was the emotional side. He was a live-at-home dad. Very early on, when it wasn't done, my father was probably the first one. And it went as far as my mom was working. And when my dad passed away, my mom was Mr. Flache's wife. Nobody knew her because she never went into the shops. So when she walked into the shops, it was only to pick up stuff that my dad had ordered or something like this. But usually it was my dad who was seen around town and around the village. So that was really, he was the present one. And I think the fact that I lost him at that time in my life had a huge impact. And yeah, like I said, it took until about 5 years ago, and then there was a big shift.
I'm going to come back to that big shift.
One thing another thread that goes through my life, that if something interests me, I apply myself to it. And if it doesn't, I don't. Or I'm having a very hard time to do it. It's just an uphill struggle if I have to learn something that I don't see the value.
Do you find that something that helps you or something that blocks you?
Both. It can help me because if I can convince myself, or if I find that something is interesting, or I can find an interesting aspect in something, that makes learning very easy.
Mm-hmm.
However, if I don't find a valuable line of research how to make this interesting, then it is really, really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I had those situations, and there is an internal struggle going on. I had to do and learn certain things for work that really didn't work for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that intrinsically were just not up my alley.
Mm-hmm. I had the same thing, and I think a lot of people, and especially young people nowadays, go through the same thing. Like, I don't know how the German system is, but here it's like you have fixed kind of courses you have to take, and not everything interests you. Even at the beginning, you have like an inkling, I'm never gonna do something with physics.
Oh, yeah,
I'm never gonna do something with chemistry. But you just have to pass it all, but the interest is just not there, or it's just not being presented interesting. And it's hard when you go online and you go on YouTube, sometimes they see the material being presented in an interesting way, so you can present it in an interesting way.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, school plans and lesson plans should, and I'm saying should, it's the word you really shouldn't use, but should and need, don't use them. What in theory should happen is that the lesson plan is set up in a way that particular goals are being reached at the end of a school year. And the lesson plan is a means to an end, in theory. In practice, the lesson plan is the Holy Bible. It's not the result that counts, but that every single box is ticked. And unfortunately, those boxes don't work for a number of students. They need a different approach. And because the boxes are there, and there's so many of them, the teacher is completely focused on the boxes. And I get that. I would be the same. I've taught, and I've been in that situation. So it's a very hard tightrope walk to do. But if I can give any advice to students, I would say, if you think the subject isn't for you, try and find a way to make it interesting for you. Try to find a link to something that fascinates you. And try to make links to things that you don't find that interesting.
We're gonna delve more into how you, let's say, in general, organize your life, and then became interested in decluttering.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about students, do you have any advice maybe for you to structure, organize, declutter their study material? Do you also have some advice for people who want to get better at studying?
Well, in terms of paperwork, and that's what we're looking at in the first place, I would say just make sure that your notes are organized. That you put the notes that go with one particular subject into one binder, and only those. Now, the important thing to do is to make sure that whenever you take notes, you don't write on the same piece of paper for multiple subjects, which is something I'm guilty of as well. So I find myself rewriting stuff or ripping paper in two and putting it in different books. But I think that's the first step. It's to make sure that you have different notebooks for different subjects. And that could be loose leaf paper that you put into a binder, or it could be physical different notebooks. Just have different colors. That in itself is good advice, and that helps. If you color code your stuff, and that's slightly OCD, I know, you can find stuff much faster. And color coding can come in little sticky bubbles that you put on the top corner of a piece of paper. If it's red, it's maths. So you only look for the red bubbles, or you mark it with a red marker or something like this.
How important is writing down? You have some people who say when you go to the class, don't write down, just listen. You will memorize more. Other people say, no, you have to write down. It makes things more personal and engraving.
It depends. It depends how you learn. There is an interesting test that you can do. And I would advise everybody to do that at least once when you're in a position that you need to memorize things and to learn and remember stuff. It's a test that helps you find out which of your senses is the best to remember things. And it's a very simple thing. It has a couple of steps, always very similar. You need someone who does the test for you. So if you were to take the test, what I would do is sit down, take 10 items, put them in a box, write down 10 items on a piece of paper, on different pieces of paper, put them in a box, have myself there to read out another set of 10 items from a piece of paper, and have another 10 items to touch. So we need 4 items. And the 5th test is where you do all at once. So what I would do is give you access to each of those items. Let's take the first box. I would show you one bit out of the box for 5 seconds and put it away. Take the next thing out, show it for 5 seconds, and go through the 10 items. And then you have to do calculations in your head for 2 minutes. So it's things like 2 plus 5, 6 minus 4. So you look at something different. And then you have a minute to remember which items you've seen. And you get a point for each item. So that's for visual. And then you do the same thing with reading the 10 items on a piece of paper, because it uses a different part of the brain. Reading is not the same as seeing. It uses similar parts, but there is different effects. So you do the same thing, 5 seconds, you put it away, 2 minutes of calculations, and then you have to repeat which items you remember. Then the next one is just reading, which is just auditory. Again, 5 seconds for each calculations. And the last one, the 4th one, is taking the box and with blindfold, just touch each item for 5 seconds. Put them away, do the math, and remember. And then the 5th one is usually a bit chaotic. You do all at once. So you have a 5th box with 10 items that you have written on a piece of paper, you say out loud, and you can look at and touch at the same time, and then put it away. So that's the test group, because that is kind of a balancing test. It usually goes pretty wild because you have so many items you have to deal with. And then you put those down on a plot, on a spiderweb plot, to see which ones are the most important for you. And that informs how you learn. If you are, when you're looking at languages, there are people who can learn languages just from hearing. I can't. I have to read it. I have to read and say it. Just hearing, it goes in here, it goes down there, it goes out there. I have to use it practically. Just reading doesn't help either. If I just learn it by heart, it goes away very quickly. And the same goes for other subjects. You have to make them into a format that you know works for you.
It's what you said before, like make sense, and then see what kind of sense makes the most sense for you. You have even some people who prime themselves for a performance by maybe looking at something or saying something or listening to something, smelling to something, because that sense is just more of a trigger for them for a certain performance or a reaction.
And you know this whole thing, these memory tricks, where you associate a word with an image in your mind. That's really just translating the auditory sense into the visual sense and adding an extra level, an extra facet to what you need to remember. It's the same with numbers. If you're having trouble with numbers, associate them with colors or with anything. So it goes into synesthesia to some degree.
Yeah.
But just think, smell is. I found in my test we did smell, and I was 10 for 10 on smell, and many people are actually.
Yeah.
Smell is a very powerful thing that is completely undervalued. And that has, if you just think, sometimes you smell something and you have this clear memory of something, of a whole complex thing from your childhood, where you were sitting with your grandma, she was baking a cake, and you were playing blah, and your mom was there, and your dad was just arriving from somewhere, and there were birds singing in the background. Suddenly you've got this whole world in your mind from just a bit of smell. So smell is a very powerful sense, but unfortunately it's pretty rubbish in terms of learning, because it's too unpredictable.
It also has to do with organizing, that you have different kind of layers, and the more connections you make, the more easily you can retrieve something.
Yeah.
So people can think of a painting, and then it's like the meta level is like painting, and then the lower is like impressionism, and then it's, you know, like
Indeed.
an impressionist. So then they think maybe of the upper level, oh, it's impressionism, or you know that it starts with a V or VR, and then you start making other connections, then bam, it's there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then that's the thing I meant about history. What I couldn't do, I had those bubbles, they were all separate, and making sense of them was to build connections and kind of fitting them in a system. Let's say it what it is, it's a system. And when it comes to learning, I think you need your system, and you need to find what works for you. And you also need to be very clear and very realistic about realizing that some things just aren't for you. If your job is suddenly changed, you're taken on as an A, and then 2 years in, you suddenly are shoved in a different position that you don't have the background for, just because it fits into the company's scheme of moving people around.
Comes back to first what you say about that interest is important, and later we can maybe talk about other things that are really important to be good at something. One thing I think is interest, but
and even interest isn't a certain grade for being good at something.
Yeah,
you can be interested and still suck at it.
Because even if you have a system, you know, if you're not interested in it, or you're not passionate or motivated about it, you know, you can have a system, but if that system is your main job and main passion, maybe a lot of people get a burnout because they're in a system that functions okay and they can do their thing, but they're not really interested in it, and they don't have a drive behind it, even though they can just go through the motions of the system.
And even so, even if you have the drive and you're interested, if you're running against a wall because nobody else is interested in getting things done, they just rely on you to fix everything that goes wrong, but they're not interested in moving forward and changing the way how they do things. You're stuck in your little perfect world. You can only go as far as teaching people how to do it, how to best do it, or how to properly do it. Because in some cases, when it comes to software, you have to know how to do it. And if people don't listen, because they're in a glorious situation that if they make an error, Tilo comes along and fixes it, because that's his job, then you're running against a wall, and you're just running in circles, and every time you come around, there's a new wall that you have to go through. It's one of those circus acts with the loop, with the hoop and the paper you have to jump through. It's just not satisfying. And at some point, that's when you get a burnout. I don't believe that most people get a burnout from overwork, but from having to do work that doesn't satisfy them. Because you can work 24 hours a day.
There's a mismatch, I think, between what they really want to be involved in, which doesn't have to be I want to be an entrepreneur and big ambition.
No.
But when there really is a mismatch between people, their skills and their personality and what they have to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I can be analytical, you can be analytical, we can still do it, but you know, the attitude with which we do it, in the end, it's like that why becomes smaller and smaller while we do something, and it's like, then it's like a burnout. The drive is not there anymore.
And then comes a time when the burnout becomes obvious and you have to find a way around it. And I had burnout, so on several occasions. And the first time I realized that I was overworked, that I liked what I did, but I was being taken advantage of. that I was working for too many people who gave me too much work. It was just a question of not physically not being able to finish it. And you have that effect when you have 5 people doing similar work, and one of them is slightly better than the others. The one who is slightly better not only gets more work, but by getting more work becomes more efficient and becomes even better than he or she was in the first place. So the differential between that one person and the others grows, which means that person gets even more work, which frustrates the others, and it also frustrates the person who gets the work. In the first instance, you're happy to be of service and you can get it done. But what I forgot in that situation is that you can only go so far. You can't continuously add more work into the mix and making it more efficient, because there comes a point when efficiency just breaks down, when you can't make it more efficient because there's just too much of it. And that's when I left my first employer in Belgium after 5 years. And I learned my lesson. I went into my next job as a part-time, 4 days a week, which was heaven on stilts. It was also not a 9-to-5 job, but it was 1 week evening, 1 week the day. So it was a half day 1 week and a full day the other week, 5 days a week in the end. But I had the luxury of having every other week where I only went into work at 4 o'clock. So I could sleep in, and I had a different routine every week. And that helped me over about half a year. I got back to a normal level and got back to being so energetic that I wanted to change. And then that's when the training thing happened.
There's a lot of misconceptions about burnout and depression and what the difference is. But for people who want to get some signals of a burnout that's approaching, what questions can people ask? How can they notice it? Or what are some signals? Or can you notice it when you're approaching a burnout?
Can you know when you're having a nervous breakdown? It's a difficult question. I think there are signs. And I also believe that burnout is not necessarily about depression, working too much, but rather ignoring or not recognizing the signs. And the classical signs are known. Classical signs for burnout is being tired all the time, being more prone to being ill. The classic thing is winter depression, a slight depression that you get. You're not quite depressed, but you're also not top of your class at the time. Being tired is a good sign. Having things like a bad stomach, like having burps all the time and the stomach being upturned all the time, having trouble digesting. So basically your body is telling you something is not quite right. And that's a grouping of being tired, being overly nervous, being not taking care of yourself. I think if it comes down to it, I think the most telltale sign is if you at some point realize that I'm not really taking good care of my body. If you're eating crap because you don't have time to cook, if you don't get enough sleep because you've got work that you need to do in the evening, and that can happen, yes, but if it's a constant thing, that's bad. Something is wrong. And that isn't, and the misconception is that there necessarily is something wrong with you. Because nobody will easily admit something is wrong with me. I think the realization should be something is wrong with the situation I'm living in. And that includes work and private and personal relations. That means sports, body, taking care of your health, taking time off and really taking time off and, excuse my French, bloody well turn off that phone.
Yeah.
And not take emails from your employer when you're on vacation. That kind of thing. I believe these days people are having a hard time actually turning off. from work. I've got a phone as well, and it's my work and private phone. So I have, let's call it a system. When I'm on vacation, for one thing, I tell my customers that I'm not there.
Mm-hmm.
I have an email reply. I change my phone reply when people are calling. So to make sure that people are calling, whenever they send me a message, whenever they try to get in touch, they will know I'm not available until such a day. But I give them an opportunity to leave a message or to send an email. And that gives me an opportunity to look at it, acknowledge it, and put it to a side. The only thing I'm doing is checking which of those I need to do first when I come back home. But that's all I'm doing. And I mark them. I flag them, or I mark them in some way, or I note which ones are the important ones. That takes me 5 minutes a day. And it doesn't really engage me with work. It just keeps me up to date. It keeps me away from trouble on that first day back in the office when I have to go through a gazillion emails. I don't have to, because I already know which ones are important. And I can deal with those first and then take the others into account. So I already know more or less what my first day is going to look like, but I don't have to worry about it because I will not do anything during my vacation.
I'm also, I don't know if you are, I'm a recovering perfectionist. Still in recovery and rehab.
Aren't we all?
Yeah. So I feel a lot of people now, because there's so much stimuli, that either as a perfectionist, you want to micromanage everything, or even as a pleaser, you want to please everyone. So you don't want to let people down. But there's so much activity, so much stimulation, so much stuff to be doing. And sometimes we voluntarily choose to be busy all the time that there's no room for spontaneity, no room to relax anymore. So, for instance, me, I wanted to do everything perfect, like perfect food, perfect exercise, perfect study, perfect, and it was just too much. I didn't let my mind, my body breathe.
Yeah. You put the thing about being a perfectionist, and you've probably seen my blog, my video log a couple of days ago, is that there is a very different perception of what is perfect that you have and others have. And I found that it's useful to make the distinction between good enough and perfect. That doesn't mean that good enough isn't good enough or isn't perfect in its own way, but what I or you perceive as perfect may be very different. And I've talked about that. It's the differential imperfection that we expect. It's that expectation of it has to be this good. Mm-hmm. And you also have a time constraint, obviously. If you're trying to be super perfect to the last iota, that does take time. And in a workflow, if one person takes too much time to be what others perceive as overly perfect, doesn't work. I also believe that there are times when our personal perfection takes precedence. And there are a lot more times when we might want to acknowledge that what we perceive as perfect isn't necessary in that particular situation. And I find that's a useful distinction. It comes into play with the decluttering as well. One of the type of people I come across are perfectionists. Mm-hmm. They want everything to be just so. And because they want it to be just so, they don't even get started. Because it's just such a huge issue that they can't understand that you have to start somewhere.
They only want to start when they know the end result will be perfect.
That's it. And for one thing, it will never be perfect because it takes time to get things started, to get things sorted and to declutter. And on the other hand, while you're doing it, you change. And your perception changes. And your expectation changes. And what you perceive as perfect changes. So you'll always have an uphill battle with that. the only way to really get started is to acknowledge that, okay, today I'm going to do that one drawer. And that's all I'm doing. It'll take, even if you think it'll take a day, you probably find it takes half an hour. And you've got a result that is not perfect, but it's satisfactory, it's pleasing, and it is a confirmation that you can do this. And that's really one of the main tricks that I'm employing for decluttering.
One of the things I also notice with this very tied, I think, to perfectionism is what I call a completionist.
Yeah.
They want to complete things.
Collectors.
And it has to be complete.
Yes.
So if they would start with the drawer, it's like, I can't leave this room this way. This room is not completely, decluttered or organized.
I haven't come across that one yet. I think it's usually time constraints that puts people back. But the main issue I'm seeing is that for perfectionists, it's the idea of leaving it or spending a lot of time not knowing where it's going exactly, and that leaves them unhinged. Because in order to be perfect, you have to have an image to start with. That's the way it should be, or that's the way I want it to be, or that's the way I expect it to be. And if you can't have that image, or if you have that image and you're aware that that image might be a mirage and might never come to be, you don't get started. But it's a very... I've come across some of those people, but they're not the majority.
You work a lot with decluttering, so I can imagine one of the things is that people just indeed procrastinate, and they put something here and they put something there, and I'll
someday I'll do
put it off later, someday I'll do it, and they keep putting it off, and it just keeps on piling up, and then it becomes such a pile that's like, it's gonna take so much time.
And again, it comes back to the same trick. Just look at parts. I've had one customer with a whole house full of stuff, and every single room had books and clothes and stuff and memorabilia and notes and paperwork, and every room had everything. And they couldn't make it go anywhere. The simple solution, and it is a simple solution, is to go and collect everything of one type and put everything together. And it starts with clothes. If you put we put everything together. We had a garage full, which luckily was empty. So we put plastic all over the place. And we had a pile about 2 meters high of clothes. She didn't even know she had. She didn't realize she had that much because it was all over the place. So we ended up sorting it into different types of clothes: summer, winter, long sleeves, short sleeves, underwear, socks, beautiful things, not so beautiful things, stuff to do gardening with, that kind of thing. And in the end, she realized that there were a lot of things that she had more than one of, simply because she didn't realize she had them. And then you buy another shirt that's the same color and the same cut because you like the look of it, and you've already got 4 of them, but you don't know where they are. So it's often down to not knowing what's there. And that was the initial spark. She realized, okay, I can do this. If I just look at particular things, the next step were books. And then we looked at all the paperwork that we reorganized. For one thing, we just shoved everything into the office to make sure all the paperwork is there. And she had a nervous breakdown at that point, nearly, because it was just papers all over the place. And I said, don't worry, we'll look at that when the time comes. And we did step by step, and we ended up with rooms that were actually usable. She still now has clothes in different rooms, but she has one cupboard with the winter stuff in one room, and she has one cupboard with the summer stuff in another room, and the gardening stuff is in the shed. So
this is a system you devised for her, right? How do you
with
set up
her,
with her? How do you
Yes.
set up systems for people?
I figure it out as I go along. It's a mental process. I get to know people. That's, I think, the magic for me. And that kind of comes from that early student time when I started interacting with people. I seem to have developed, and that's after the last shift, I seem to have developed a knack for feeling out what people are happy with to do, and to suss out if a particular option I put in front of them phases them, or if they're ready to embrace it, or if they're already halfway there, if they can already see this is working. So if I'm lucky and I come across somebody, I say, why don't we separate those out into, first we take out the doubles and we give them to charity, and then we separate them out, and maybe you put the winter stuff in one place and the summer stuff in another. And she just came up, okay, well, let's put the winter stuff in that cupboard and the summer stuff in that one, because now it's summer and that's nearer to where I'm sleeping, blah, blah, blah. So she came up with the idea herself. But I planted the seed. And that's the trick. You can't declutter for someone else.
Because we have these series on TV, Hoarders, for instance.
That's a completely different issue.
That people really find it difficult to throw away stuff.
Yeah.
Why? Because they might need it one day. And even if they might not need it their entire life, but just in case they need it, they just put it. Yeah.
It's here. It's all, even with the lady I just described, it was here. It was the perception of what she had, because she couldn't make sense of it. It didn't make sense to her. There was just too much. It's like white noise. It's always there, but you don't realize it's there. It's just a mess. Hoarders, there is a thin line between a hoarder and somebody who's disorganized. There is a difference between disorganized and cluttered. And the next step is somebody who is medically unable to let go.
What is the difference between disorganized and cluttered?
Disorganized is cluttered. Disorganized is if you can't find things. Disorganized for me is a completely different thing to you. I've worked in law firms long enough to know that an office that has piles of paper along the wall is untidy, but it's not necessarily disorganized, because the lawyer in question could tell me exactly it's pile 5 from the corner, about 10 centimeters in. That's where you find a blue binder, and that has all the information you're looking for. And you bloody well made sure that you put the binder back in exactly the same place. But that's not disorganized. That's just untidy. Cluttered adds more to the mix. It's disorganized, but it's disorganized in a way that even the person who is disorganized can't find it. So, and hoarding goes even further. Hoarding is a medical, it's a mental condition. That is really a conditioning that goes to a place where you have a physical reaction to letting something go. So it's a spectrum.
Yeah.
You have people who are really near a breakdown if they have to let go of something. And you have people who would happily let go of things if they just knew which ones, and how to get around the mental struggle that informs their choice to keep something. Why do we keep things? Because we like them. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Because we use them all the time. Perfect. Why not? Because we have been given them as gifts. There's an element of obligation. There's an element of, I don't really like that vase, but It's an heirloom. I have to keep it. You keep things because they're valuable, or because you paid a lot of money for it and you just couldn't bear the idea of throwing something out that cost a lot of money.
Yeah,
even though
this ownership experience that once people bought something, they find it hard to throw away because they're the owner now, and they have that ownership experience.
That's just the most common ones. Some things are completely inconspicuous to someone else, but they have an enormous meaning. They have an emotional element that is so paramount to the person who owns it that there simply is no way and no need to let it go. What I find is helpful is to, again, start small and start decluttering with things that tend not to have too much emotional attachment. And I say tend not to have because it depends on the personality. I've had people who are so attached to their books, even though they haven't read them in 20 years, but they all have an emotional aspect. A friend of mine had that, and we figured out that it wasn't the books themselves, but the covers for him. So the obvious solution was to take pictures of the covers, and he suddenly could let go of the books. It's for him, it was the emotion attached to the cover, not to what he read in the book because he knew what was in there, not because the book smelled a certain way or it felt a certain way in most cases, but it was the purely visual aspect. And once we figured that out, it was easy going. We could separate out about a third of the books.
What is the link between clutter and how we organize and how our room and working space looks with our mindset, how we feel?
Clutter to me feels like a symptom of an imbalance, of some kind of imbalance, or an inability to see something clearly. It's that white noise thing again. You get used to the way things look and you don't realize they're there anymore. They just fade into the background. Your conscious mind doesn't see it anymore. Your subconscious is constantly nagged by it. And a good way of seeing this is being absent for a couple of weeks. You've probably had that too. You go away, you come back after a couple of weeks, and your space feels different. It looks different, and you suddenly realize certain things in your space that didn't register before. And that's because you have forgotten about that blocking mechanism is gone. And you're seeing it like you're seeing it for the first time. And the longer you've been away, the more pronounced that is. And that's the perfect time to do decluttering because you're very much aware what is in the way. You're very much aware of things that you had forgotten about.
It's the same thing, and I think a lot of guys or girls can relate that when you live by yourself, you oftentimes have more clutter, and then a girl or a guy comes to your place, then you realize, I have to clean it up because it's for somebody else.
Clean up,
and when it's for you, it's like, well, it's fine, I can live with this.
Yes. It's a different perception, and it's a different aspiration as well that you have. You want to project a certain image. And yes, if you're on your own, if you're single, you may not care about this that much. But yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's down to, well, what if I meet somebody and they come home with me? So maybe it's time to clear up your act before that happens.
It's oftentimes also what women or one part of the gay relationship talks about, that it's always such a mess. And like my mom was also like, it isn't clean yet, I have to clean this up first, like, like
it's like my mom.
Can it become sometimes even too obsessive even to make things clean? Like
yeah, because there are obsessions related to cleaning. Well, there's this whole thing of I have to clean everything, and germophobia and that kind of thing. So those are medical things. Those are actual illnesses, mental illnesses.
I know somebody said if a cluttered desk is a sign of a cluttered mind,
No.
what is a clean desk a sign of?
No.
But I talked with some creative people, and sometimes they like chaos.
Yes, it's the eternal discussion. I'm personally more along the lines of I want my desk clean, and I believe that there is something to have inspiration in your space. Yes, but there's a difference between a desk that is covered in miscellaneous rubbish and a desk that contains or that holds things that actually inspire you. Personally, I'm not inspired by a disorganized pile of paper on my desk. If anything, it makes me think, oh, I have to take care of this. So it's a negative thing more than a positive, and I can't believe anybody actually sees a pile of paper as something positive, especially if it contains bills and things you have to look at and read through, and that form obligations that are time sensitive that you have to deal with. So paperwork is a specific thing. I can see inspiration and items that make you think and feel in certain ways are important. I've got my little altar at my home that has spiritual items on it, and I've got another collection of things that are small items that I brought from places that mean something to me. And there are about 10 of them. And I can say where they come from. But even there, I find that occasionally I'm stumped and I can't tell where those things come from. And if that's the case, I throw them out.
Do you think in general a clean desk is for most people very beneficial?
For the organized-minded, yes. I think the question is, what is a clean desk? Again, with the untidy and disorganized. If it's untidy, it contains pizza boxes and bits of food and a shoe and a dirty t-shirt from last week and that kind of thing. That's just untidy. I'm sorry. That's A, it's not hygienic, and B, I don't think it really inspires anyone. If it is a desk that contains things that are actually used and that have a purpose, and that's not necessarily that they're being used, but they look good or they make me feel better at that desk, I wouldn't describe that as untidy. It's just disorganized to someone else, not necessarily to me. Your desk, for example, it has a couple of items on it. They make sense. They don't necessarily look tidy, because what's tidy? To some person, a tidy desk is one that doesn't have anything on it.
I also sometimes have this talk with myself, if I should just put everything that I need within hand reach but not in eyesight, and that I just put it away in a drawer, and that it's a very clean desk or not, because now I have the things that I use within grasp, but it is a bit untidy. And
as long as you find it okay, and at the end of the day, the trick is to, and again with decluttering is a process. The main process is to get the space into a situation where you can function in it. For me, that's the main thing. But the secondary goal is to make it happen in a way that the person who works and lives and breathes in that space is able to maintain the functionality of the room. And that's the important thing. If I'm dealing with somebody who has a structured way of thinking and they have lots of paperwork on their desk, it's a very simple question of telling them, okay, you need three trays, everything that comes in, pending and filing. Everything you get through the mailbox in the door, you put on top, and you know everything that's on top needs to be dealt with. And it sits there. It doesn't have to do anything. One day in the week, you sit down, you take everything out, and you deal with things as they come along. And you read it, you finish dealing with it, and then you finish it. Either it goes into pending or it goes into file.
Yeah, I think it has to do with a system and also
You have to find a system.
with what kind of mood you would like to cultivate in a certain room.
Yeah.
So when you want to be in a creative mood, and maybe that chaos kind of stimulates you a bit, but especially when I clean up, I don't look forward to it, but after I did it, it's like, there's space now. There's more openness now. This is a place I can come home to, and there's less chaos here, especially when there's been a lot of chaos in life outside or at my job. Then I come home, it's like, it's already a bit more organized and calm here. I can also organize and calm down a bit because it influences my mind state in a way.
But you were talking about creativity. Does that affect your sense of creativity you get from the desk? I get the feeling that you do. So that is a classic example for that wave movement. You have moments when the creativity doesn't cut it anymore and it just looks cluttered. It looks messy. And then you get into a frenzy and you clean it up. And then it's fine until you feel, I'm blocked in my creativity. I need a bit more mess in my life. And then it shifts back. It's like that thing you could buy in the 90s, the Perspex box with the blue tinted water in it that wobbled, and you had this wave going left and right. It's a similar thing. I don't believe, and that's why I said the perception and the current state of everybody is very important. And that changes. That's what I meant with the block for the perfectionist. The current state of affairs changes within a couple of days.
That's probably why you advise systems, that you have a system that it doesn't have to get to this end to get going again, or that you have so much resistance because...
The trick is to find something that works for that person, that keeps them in a balance between complete OCD and complete mess. And the balance needs to work for that person. And the effort spent to keep the balance has to be as small as possible. Or at the very least, at a level that that person is happy with.
I think also the importance of a system is that they give it the time and give it the attention before it runs out of hand. But people put it, when it doesn't run out of hand, low on the priority list because it doesn't take a lot of time, or they had to do other stuff and they find excuses. So if you put it into a system, then each month I do my administration, each week I file my letters or pay my bills, and then it's like, okay, it's only half an hour. But paradoxically, it's often that because it only takes 5 minutes, because it only takes half an hour, it's like, I will postpone it. So the reason why they should do it now is a reason that they postpone it.
But that it's the old conundrum that is how things work. And the main point is that everybody has to realize that for themselves. You have to come to that realization on your own accord. And the only thing I can do as a declutterer is to guide people to find their own truth and to find what works for them, because I don't know that. I can make educated guesses based on what I see, based on what I hear, based on what I sense coming from people. But at the end of the day, whatever I propose has to work for that person. And one of the things I make very clear from the beginning is that I'm not going to steamroll you into a particular system, but I'm going to make suggestions. And it's up to you to tell me your yeses and your nos.
There is now a famous psychology professor who gives lectures, which is called Jordan Peterson, and he talks about a lot of things about mythology, psychology, etc. And his credo and his meme that's being shared is like, sort yourself out. And one of the things he says to start with is clean your room. Clean your room. It will clean your mind. It will give you more perspective about what mind state do I want in this room, how I want this room organized, how do I want myself and my little kingdom that I have, my house organized. And then you can maybe organize your ideas and organize the world, but it starts with sorting yourself out, sorting your room out, and physically also sorting yourself out, cleaning your room and starting from that. So even he who delve in so many psychology themes just says like, what are you gonna sort everything outside of yourself if you can't even clean your own room?
Well, the old saying, healthy mind in a healthy body. I would go as far as saying healthy body and healthy mind in a healthy space. I understand what he says, and there is truth to it. For the simple reason that the physical world can be seen and touched, and it's much easier to deal with and to sort out than whatever happens in your brain. And we've already touched on things like obligations, mental blocks, beliefs, limitations that we impose on ourselves, that kind of thing. There's a plethora of those. But when you look at that, that's a can of worms that is more difficult to deal with than simply cleaning your room. And that could be done by simply making sure that, a classic trick is to make sure that you don't put anything on the floor. Just keeping the floor clean is something, or clear, is a very, very interesting exercise. You'd be surprised how much stuff you've put on the floor. I'm not saying that there's a lot of stuff on the floor here, but I mean, it's amazing. Once you realize and once you look, you'll find bits of paper in one corner, and you've got a bag of stuff that should really go somewhere else sitting on the floor. It's a very simple exercise to realize how much you've really got, and you move your way up.
And oftentimes when somebody starts with self-development, an important aspect is just taking responsibility, but people want to see results, and mental results to see is difficult. It's often with other people, but if you work out, then you see it. Or if you clean your room, it's like, oh, I did this. You can see the results of your effort. So often those things give you a little bit of, self-worth and self-efficacy that you can do it.
And they filter back into your brain. The fact that I usually try to start with things, very simple exercises, not only builds self-confidence, but it also makes people realize that they can do it. That they might have a hang-up with certain things. Just doing a drawer and realizing, oh, I'm having a hard time throwing this away. Why is that? Or they might not even realize it, but when we look at the drawer again the next time, I might come up with the question, well, this is completely useless. Why did you keep it? And I'm not putting blame on anyone, but it's just the question that begs answering at that point. And sometimes those things are very obvious. You've got broken items, or things that have seen better days, or you've got 5 erasers, none of which has been used more than once. That kind of thing. And then the question helps the person I'm asking to come to a realization and to move forward with that. And just realizing why you have 5 erasers in your drawer and figuring out, well, I don't really need those, helps figuring out the harder stuff along the line. Why do I have a hang-up about red clothes? Or why can't I get rid of my grandma's? I'm finding that the more you work on that kind of realization, the easier it gets to, I wouldn't say throw things out, but to come to the understanding that something isn't really necessary.
What was for you on a mental or emotional level difficult to let go of?
Interesting one. Are we talking beliefs or physical stuff?
What resonates with you?
I didn't really have problems letting go of physical stuff. Still don't. I do have a couple of things that need to happen, and I know that. I'm aware of it, but I just can't bring myself to it, but I just don't have the time, to be honest. And I haven't found the opportunity to let go. I've got a coin collection, for example, which I've done for many, many years, and about 5 years ago I gave up on it. So it's just sitting there, but it's one of those items that potentially has value, and you need to find somebody to pay some money for it, because it's not the kind of thing you throw out or you give to charity. But on a mental level, letting go of... There's one thing I'm getting to grips with, that's a feeling of self-worth. And that's one of the things that shifted 5 years ago, started to shift. I never really believed that whatever I was doing was worth anything. And that clearly has changed. And I'm not even sure if that's a symptom of something else or if it's something that has shifted. But
what changed 5 years ago?
Well, 5 years ago I've been working for the same company for a long time. And I found that I was in a bit of a dead end. There was no way I could move into an interesting position within the company. I was a trainer. I started to be a trainer when I worked there for a year. And then I was a trainer for full-time for about 12 years. And I worked in practically all the European offices. So I had about 15 offices I went to on a regular basis. And then the company merged with another one that had a different training culture. And I was kind of kept, but didn't really have that function anymore. So I felt like I was in a vacuum. And I ended up getting a lot of functions that didn't really gel with me. They tried to find something to fit me in, but nothing worked. And I was just sad. I was just sad in that position. I kept training occasionally, and I had 2 offices left I went to, but the function had changed completely, and I wasn't happy with what I was doing.
You weren't functioning anymore.
Yeah, I wasn't functional. That's the thing. I didn't have a purpose in that company.
In being valued for what you deem yourself valuable.
And I very much relied on being valued by other people. And that dropped away. I still got valuation, but I had this nagging feeling that because I was not doing what I was meant to do in the first place, that didn't really count. And I went on a bit of a roller coaster of depression, which started out one year in January, and my office manager at the time said, you need vacation, and you're not just going to take 2 weeks of sick leave, but I want you to take two weeks of sick leave, and I want you to go away, and I want a postcard from somewhere warm. So she actually overstepped her own boundaries, because she was basically telling me to take sick leave and go on a vacation, which I highly recommend for everyone. But that was in January. And a couple of years later, I had a visit from another colleague who I've been working with pretty much from the beginning. She started in the company 2 months after me. And she walked into my office and she closed the door and she said, you need to do something, because you are getting depressed again in October, and this will keep going until the sun comes out again after the winter. And this is too long. You have to make changes. This can't go on. You're just working yourself into a frenzy over the whole winter, and it just gets worse and worse every year. And she was right. And I needed to get this wake-up call. And I took it at face value, because I realized it was true. And the weird thing was, or maybe it's karma or kismet, or call it divine intervention, I decided that day that I had to change. I had tried to find a different job for a couple of years before that, but I just couldn't. And I said, yes, now when things come along, opportunities, anything, I'll say yes. So I became Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, a week and a half later, I got an email from a vague acquaintance, a friend of a friend in London, who said, well, I just come back from this fabulous festival in Wales, of all places. You should look into that and go there next year. And I looked at the website, Tantra for Gay Men, and I thought, well, fabulous. That looks like something I would never in my wildest dreams have done, so let's just sign up for it. I waited another month before the sign up finally opened, and I was the first person to sign up. It came on and yes, go for it. I want the single room.
Yeah.
The only single room in the whole thing. So
Okay.
everything was double, triples, double beds, dorms.
Yeah.
And it was 10 months ahead. So I signed up in November of 2013. And I went in end of August 2014, which was really, I was waiting. And in the meantime, I did a lot of other stuff. So I started lots of things that looked vaguely interesting, but nothing really captured my interest. And then the time came, I went to London and I stayed with friends, and I was on the verge of wussing out. I wasn't sure if I wanted to take the trip to Wales and go there into the wilds, into something that I couldn't really put my finger on. And they convinced me. They said, well, you've already made the trip here. You bloody well get your ass in gear and you go to Wales and you do that. You've been talking about this for the last 10 months. You go. And I stepped on the train. I went there. I was picked up by the weirdest person you could possibly imagine, in a car with two other people who were completely silent, who didn't say a word. I felt like, okay, well, now I'm being taken to the slaughterhouse somewhere in the hills of Wales. And it turned out to be one of the best experiences of my life. So I arrived, my friend was there. He took care of me. The one who told me about it, who's a yoga teacher, and who taught yoga there. And he brought me to my room and he calmed me down, and I was like, and everybody was talking about the life outside and what they do and where they come from, and everybody was nervous because most people were new. It was only the second time that festival was running. We were about 65 people all in all, if that, maybe 60. And it was a revelation. We were doing things, or I was doing things that in my wildest dreams I would never have thought I'd do. The tantra bits obviously were quite involved. Lots of nakedness, so it's a naked positive space. So after day 2, everybody was just running around naked. We had luck with the weather because it was hot. We've never been so hot in Wales ever. It was a completely secluded space that felt absolutely safe, with a little river, with forest, with sheep running around, 2 pet pigs, giant pet pigs walking around, and dogs, and it was just wonderful. You can't put it otherwise. It was wonderful.
So for people who don't know what tantra is and what it entails, how would you describe tantra?
Well, it's really a spiritual movement that is slightly unusual because it doesn't just focus on the mental. It doesn't just focus on what's perceived in the mind, but Tantra is body positive. So it is very open to any kind of physicality. And I mean very open and any kind of physicality. So it comes, you've got the whole range from naked sadhu sitting on a mountaintop, freezing his back off and dispensing pearls of wisdom to his occasional visitors, through all kinds of mishmash of different techniques to the purely sexual. So if you've heard of Osho, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and his ashram, that's pretty much the extreme. So that's the whole range. And
because when I think of every bodily experiences, I can imagine that it demands trust and safe space and respecting boundaries.
Absolutely. And that is where the two extremes are extremes. If you're just in the mental space and you disregard the bodily, the physical side of your existence, that is interesting, but it is limiting. Whereas if you're just going for the physical side and you neglect the meditative side, or you misuse the physical side, that is also very extreme. It's still part of Tantra, because traditionally Tantra has always been sectarian. There are a couple of basic things that go with Tantra. It's meditation, it is physical exercise, yoga is part of it. Sensuality is very important. So the physical side doesn't necessarily have to be rigorous physical exercise. There could be something as simple as this. That is part of how you experience your body. It could be breath, the way you breathe through different ways, either through the nostril or the mouth, how you perceive the air going into your lungs, where the air goes. Do you breathe all the way down to your lower lung, or do you just breathe very shallow? Do you breathe in and out in a particular rhythm? Do you hold your breath when everything is in or everything is out? There's loads of ways just to work with breath.
We talked in the beginning about that 4 or 5 years ago you shifted. You felt like emotionally and personally and interpersonally you had to deal with some things that you weren't aware of. And you already did some yoga. So I'm wondering, like, what new layer, what new aspect did Tantra uncover?
For one thing, I was doing things on my own. I was meditating on my own, and it was seated meditation, the kind of meditation where you don't move. You're just working here. And the yoga was, I did some classes, yes, but I did yoga on my own. It was more of a physical exercise than anything else. I didn't link the meditative side with the physical. There were two things that were separate and running side by side. Now, one thing I learned at the Tantra Festival was to incorporate the two by using breath to increase the spiritual, the meditative aspect, by using sensuality to increase the physical side, by using erotic massage to go further, while applying breath and visualizing things. So if you're familiar with the chakras, there's a lot of work with chakra energy and raising energy, that kind of thing. It sounds kind of oogie woogie when you're not familiar with it, but
how were you drawn to this? Because we always think the Germans as people being very organized, very down to earth, very structured. You even said, like, yeah, I'm organized but not OCD, but organization systems has always been important for you. How did you first got drawn into spirituality and spiritual practices?
I think it was an outlet. It was a pressure valve. I realized that there has to be more. And remember, at that time, I was still in that emotional no man's land. So I was actively looking for a way out of that emotional desert. And one of the things that I found valuable as a starting point were yoga and meditation, because they felt very powerful to me. And they were. But there was still this glass ceiling. I couldn't get beyond that. And for one thing, I couldn't mix them. I couldn't bring them together. It was either spiritual or physical. And to be quite honest, that strain is still there. I'm still not completely there. There are things that I keep separate. And I would like to mix them together, and I'm working on that. But it's a process.
I had the same thing when, and maybe you can relate that, I did some spiritual practices and I dabbled with it, but I always try to approach it from the mind and again make it into a system and again try to make it organized. While it's more about emotions, it's about sexuality, sensuality, about energy, and when you keep on approaching your one talent and then you try to cultivate something which is about something else, maybe something that really gets you in your body, really gets you connecting with people, really uncovers emotion, it's like, now I'm also cultivating other aspects beside the mental thing, which is a strength. I don't know.
The interesting thing, I can absolutely relate to this, and I think that's why my practice of yoga and meditation didn't go very far, because I tried to make sense of it, and it's just not the kind of thing you can make sense of. And that's what shifted in that festival. It took me 5 days. The festival took 5 days, but it took me 3 days. There was a huge level of self-conscious, of going into... I never had a problem with being naked, so that wasn't an issue. And we were properly prepared for the exercises. There was a lot of talk about yeses and nos, and you may have heard that yeses and nos before when we were talking about decluttering. So that's one thing I took out of this. But about making it very clear that whatever we do, we have to feel that we make a safe choice. A physical safety, so we don't do any postures that we feel aren't good for us. Psychological safety, if we feel this is a no and we don't want to do it, you have to say it. And sexual safety, if it comes to that. But those three things were paramount, and they were imbued in everything and are still imbued in everything. And it makes perfect sense. And that's exactly the only level of structure I needed. That put me in a frame of mind where I could say, okay, with this framework in place, I can let go. I don't need any structure beyond that. And the first couple of workshops were tough going for everyone, because you're working with people you don't know, and you're surrounded by naked men. Nobody knows.
Sounds like Greece, in the old days.
Yeah, but it's like nobody knows quite where this is going, and obviously the whole workshop exercise thing is building to something in the end, but nobody quite knows where to go. So back to the perfectionist here. And the first two tantra things didn't really quite work for me. I couldn't make sense of it. And then on day 3 in the afternoon, we had the extraordinary opportunity to do a dance thing. What was it called? Ecstatic dance, which was basically just a guided dance therapy. And I was never a dancer. I never could move. I always felt like everybody's looking at me. Look at the guy who can't move his limbs. And I was just self-conscious about it. And I was probably the only one who wasn't going to go to that one. And my neighbor in the room next door, Richard, he said to me, you will go to that, because this is the single most brilliant thing you'll ever do. And it's the only woman in the space who is well known for that kind of work, dance work in all kinds of communities. And he said to me, you go there, because that is what's going to do it for you. And he was right. We went in, and she did this whole routine where you start out with not looking and just moving your head and just slowly going into, and then at some point opening your eyes and looking at your own feet and just move around. And when you bounce into somebody, you start dancing with them. And kind of builds. And then we were asked to do our craziest moves in the middle of the room, surrounded by everybody else. And so everybody did that at some point. And because it was such a hot summer, by that time we were all pretty much naked. So it's just pandemonium and body paint and glitter, and it's like madness. It felt like a unicorn party. And then that was an hour or so, and we were properly exhausted because it was really bouncing around and jumping up and down and really. And then she shifted gear. And by that time, we were in groups of 4. And she just asked every group of 4 to sit down, have one person in the middle and just hold them. And I was the first one in the middle, and it took me 2 seconds flat, and I was in tears. I was just crying. Mm-hmm. Crying like I've never cried before since I was a kid. And
do you know why?
Just a release. I got in touch with my emotions. It was the whole pent-up emotion of the last 30 years that just came out. It's not at all. It was just spectacular, and I wasn't the only one. During the festival, everybody is paired up in families. So because the teachers obviously can't take care of everything that happens to everybody. So we have those contact groups that we meet every day for an hour. And I was lucky that one guy from my family was in that group of 4. And we just ended up looking into each other's eyes and set each other off. He started crying, I started crying. He started crying, I started crying. And when he was in the middle, it was exactly the same thing. So there was a connection between the 2 of us and with the other 2 as well. So it was a really powerful thing to do. And I was completely discombobulated afterwards. I couldn't do anything. I was just like, now what? It's like, the world has opened. And that was followed in the evening by a couple of other more spiritual events that took place with a culmination of a pretty much epiphany night where I saw things. Basically, it comes down to being one with the universe. And, I talked to the teachers on the next day, and one of them actually told me at that point that what I've experienced sounds like the thing that Buddhists spend years to achieve.
Yeah, they call in Hinduism, they call it like samadhi.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Beside that feeling, what did it change of your relationship with yourself and the relationship with the universe, having that experience?
I suddenly realized that I'm part of something, that I'm not alone. I think that's what it boils down to. That I'm not separate from everyone else, but that I'm connected to everybody. And I can honestly say, and that sounds very, very cheesy and new agey, but I can honestly say that I feel a connection with a lot of people that I've met over the years in similar situations where there's more than just an attraction, but there is a spiritual understanding. There are a couple of people I can actually tell when they're in pain. Even if they're far away, I know to call them, and usually there is something wrong. I've got a couple of people that I met this year at the festival, which was a couple of weeks ago. I've gone through the diploma. I've done a 3-year diploma of tantra, which was extremely intense and taught us a lot of things that go way beyond what's taught at the festival. And I met one of the people who had just done 1 year. And it was really, I've had that before, but with him it was really extreme. Whenever I touched him, he went into electric shudders. And even if it's just by accident, standing in the queue next to each other, he basically dropped everything. He just couldn't go away. And I had a similar thing with my diploma group in the first year, that we met at a massage workshop in London where 5 of us were present. And that was a couple of months after the diploma. And whenever one of us had a very physical reaction to the massage, everybody went into this. People could tell who was in the same group. It's like one of us was just going, and the others were just shaking. It's really absurd. And to the outsider, it sounds probably preposterous, but that's my experience. So it's my personal experience. It doesn't mean that everybody has a similar one, but there is a link to a very special link to my brothers in that particular group. And because we've done similar things, there is a very, very strong connection to everybody else who does that program.
So that's partly why you cultivate more personal, interpersonal relationship,
Yes.
your gut feeling,
Yes.
intuition. Did you feel you always had that feeling, or was it uncovered, or did you cultivate it?
I think it was partly uncovered, but I feel it's cultivated. It's something that the seed was there, and I was ready to make it flower and to make use of it. Even if making use sounds a bit strange in that context, but I believe it's something that I'm meant to use, and that I'm meant to use to fix things. There are a number of discussions I had with other people in similar situations, and we're starting to figure out that there is a system there. And I call it a system, it's not really, but...
Because oftentimes what you do with decluttering is removing obstacles so people can see more clearly. It's kind of like the same thing what people do in spiritual practices do. It's uncovering who people are, which was already there, but people didn't see clearly enough, so they just remove the obstacles so they can see more clearly.
So I'm using a lot of this in a very practical way. In a practical way, in the original sense of the word. It's just a tool. And to me, that's a very different approach from tantra. In tantra, it's more than a tool. It has more meaning. But that doesn't mean... Well, in tantra, it's a tool and it has meaning. Whereas in decluttering, to me, it feels more like a tool to achieve a certain result. And it seems to work. So the lessons I've learned in tantra can be transposed into business, because a lot of the tenets of tantra are actually very useful in business, and they are already being used. So
Could you give an example?
Focus, for example. Tantra teaches to focus on details and to do things very slow. So this kind of thing is completely different from that. So if you've ever had a massage, you can either have the massage where you really massage the muscles, or you can have a sensual massage where it's more about the touch than the actual effect. The same applies to focus. If you focus on details in tantra to enhance a particular thing that you're doing, the same applies to business. You have to look at your product. It has to be good. You have to check that nothing is broken. You have to look for errors. It's all about the detail. It's also about details when it comes to payments, about accounts. Look at the details and your business will be better for it. Another example is Tantra, like many other Eastern philosophies, deals in setting intentions. So you have to set intentions when you do something. Business isn't much different. You set goals, you try to make them happen, you follow up on them, you evaluate your goals, you make sure that whatever you set out to do actually happens. The approach is slightly different. It's a much more physical and less visceral approach. But in Tantra, when you set an intention, it makes sense, because Tantra teaches that you're part of everything and everything is part of you. You're connected to everything. So setting intentions makes perfect sense, because whatever you do not just has an effect on you or the person you're doing it to, but on everything. Even if you just think of doing it, it might have an effect on everything. So that deep sense of cause and effect is very much ingrained in business. There's a lot of other things that apply as well, but those are the ones that come to mind.
From working with people and doing tantra work and getting better at interpersonal relationships, what do you feel people mostly are looking for in life? When you really go
in
to
general,
the essence,
happiness. I believe everybody wants to be happy. That's the one thing that it boils down to. That can come in different shapes and sizes. There can be happiness because you've got a lot of money. Can be happiness because you're spending your day helping someone else. But it's not about the sense of achievement. At the end of the day, achievement is a means to an end.
And what is preventing people to be happy, you feel?
From my personal point of view, I can honestly say that it was that I didn't believe in myself.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't believe I could do anything worthwhile. And once I cut that cord and I realized that what I do has worth. And while it's nice to be told that occasionally, I don't necessarily need that anymore. That was the big shift. And that was the big shift that allowed me to take a lot of steps that brought me where I am now.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of them. Another thing was that belief in myself in itself is important. That I can do things, that I don't have to worry about everything. I don't have to be concerned too much about financial security. I do have a bit of money on the side, and that allowed me to start a business. Not that that's enough to live by for years and years, but it gave me the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, I was ready to say, why don't I invest this in myself? I was walking away from physical things, from owning a home or buying a car or anything like this. The big change was that understanding that investment can come in different shapes and sizes.
How much do you feel of your reality has to do with self-belief?
Of mine personally?
In general,
In
like
general.
how much of your reality is being manifested by your belief that you can do it?
I never thought about this. Off the cuff, I'd say it's an important part of it. I wouldn't put a percentage on that, but believe in being able to do something, or believe in potentially being able to do something, is important. And it's the kind of thing I also believe that we should invest more in children. Because at this point I get the impression that they're being taught they have to compete from a young age. And there's no problem with competition in itself. It's a good tool. But the problem with competition is that if you have 20 kids competing for the first prize, you'll have 19 that are disappointed and only one that actually gets something out of it. And for me, those numbers aren't good. To me, that feels like you're cheating those 19 kids over a bit of self-worth. Especially if there is a clear understanding that the only way to go forward is that you're a winner.
I feel that as a recovering perfectionist, that a lot of times your self-worth is tied to doing. So if you really want to balance your life out and not only constantly keep on taking action and look to the next result, that indeed a spiritual practice or a body practice or a social relationship that you don't have to do, but you can just be. That's really important, because if you're going to keep on finding it in skills and new knowledge, it's always going to be like more doing, which is useful. But if that's the only association you make, you will always run behind the facts and get exhausted and never be satisfied.
Talking about exhausted, a thing came to mind. I'm running a bi-weekly workshop as well, a meetup group where people come to discuss what they do in terms of decluttering, and I kind of guide them and give them tips what they can do and challenges for the next time. And what I found is that I experience an intense sense of love when it comes to the results. It's not a sense of achievement, but it's this feeling of love. The fact that I am able to guide someone else to achieve something and see the change it makes for them. If I could live off that, I'd happily do that.
Yeah.
That, for me, is the only sense of achievement I need. To see that someone else has managed to move forward. And it's so diametrically different and opposed to what I did 5 years ago. That was 5 years ago, it was reactive, it was constantly running after the fact, what you just said. And now it feels like I'm gaining strength from doing this. Whereas in the past, I just was tired all the time. And if I'm tired now, I'm happy tired. And it's love. That's what tantra is about as well. So at the end of the day, I can't see any other thing I would want to do.
Now, before we delve into the concluding questions, is there any aspect or something you would like to share that we haven't talked about yet?
Business tantra? Well, I'm going to explore tantra more. I'm going to start doing classes myself, and especially working with couples. I'd like to do that because I believe there is a need for that. If only to, and not just to spice up their sex life, but to give people a deeper understanding of their own emotional framework.
Yeah, it is. It sounds like it's something very emotional and has to do with trust. And we live in a society, especially in the West, where sometimes people associate tantra with sex, but it's always when you touch somebody, it's immediately sexual because there's not a lot of ritual meeting places now at this moment where people just touch each other, and be physical with each other without it having to lead to sex, So it also creates a space to just be comfortable with your body and just express. Now we just get naked or get like intimate with people we want sex with or want to be our relational partner. And I think people crave for affection,
for
and physicality and sensuality.
It's physicality and sensuality rather than sexuality. And from my personal experience, I don't think I ever had problems finding a partner for sex when I needed to. What is very different is finding somebody you trust enough to open up and be vulnerable. Because it doesn't feel to me like sex, just the act of sex, is making yourself vulnerable. And that is, again, a thing that has changed for me. That's another shift. That I'm okay with being vulnerable and opening up. for heaven's sake, I sat on the train today on the Eurostar, and I was crying to music. I listened to music and it just brought up emotions.
Yeah.
Watching the landscape that I've been accustomed to for 25 years pass by outside and listening to highly emotional music. Well, I was just sitting there with a well, for lack of a better word, probably a towel to wash everything up. I think that's an important part. Most people don't have that. It's again a result of what I've gone through, and I can only wish for more people to experience that, to just be open to vulnerability for yourself and towards others, and just saying what's what, not treading on
and
eggshells.
being vulnerable is a very brave move, because especially when you're intimate, you expose yourself to the other person, so it demands trust. People can even be or I can be naked with somebody and I can look vulnerable because I'm naked, but still I'm focused on the end result, and I'm not really being physical and being there, and the breathing and the rhythm, and the sense and the smell. So I'm there, but I'm not there at the same time, It's difficult also to shut up our brains and become less performance oriented.
But that's where the meditation comes in. That's really what part of the tantra exercises are. It's not just when I said before I had this meditation and yoga practice that were sitting on different planets basically. When I first started tantra, I managed to bring them nearer and overlap and then join at some point, but it was still just me. There was this sense of everything else was there and I was connected, yes, but it's a completely new level of intimacy if you manage to, on the one hand, when you're doing tantric exercises for yourself, you bring breath, muscle work, meditation, visualization, movement together. It's tricky enough for one person, but the pinnacle of intimacy is if you have two people who manage to bring that in unison. That to me is intimacy. It's not the act of sexuality. That can be part of it, but I'd venture a guess that if you're on that level of communion with someone else, that sex is the last thing on your mind. It really is. I've had a number of those experiences, and let me tell you that they were mind-blowing. It's not the kind of thing you would just ram bam, thank you ma'am. It's a completely different thing.
Yeah, we talked before about making sense of the senses and then really involving all your senses into your experience. If people want to find out some resources that could help them with decluttering, some people, some mentors or practices that you can do with decluttering and with tantra, what are some resources, people, books, methods that you could advise people to start with?
Decluttering and tantra in one go, I don't think you'll find, unless I write a book at some point, which I plan to. Decluttering, there are a couple of books on the market that are relatively famous. There obviously is the Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo, which is an interesting book to read, with a couple of provisos that I find are difficult to apply in Western life. But again, it's a worthwhile book to read. If you're more into the Feng Shui approach, there's Karen Kingston, Decluttering with Feng Shui, which has a bit more theory in it, Feng Shui theory, which I personally don't subscribe to, but I found it interesting to read. And there's a couple of books that deal more with the practical side of decluttering, especially with paperwork. And I don't have any names there, but if you type in decluttering, in Amazon, there are loads of books that will come up.
And what are some useful books about Tantra that people can read or get introduced with Tantra? Because I can imagine Tantra is a very broad area.
Well, it is. There are a couple of typical candidates to read. Obviously, Osho's books are a bit of a basis for Neo-Tantra, which is what we're usually confronted with. His books are tricky to read because they're usually transcripts of what he talked about, a bit like the hadith of the Islam and the annotations that you get sometimes from talks. There's one in particular that I would recommend if you want to read something really intense and difficult to read. It's a book called Tantra by Osho.
Easy, yeah.
Yeah, it's easy to remember. It's difficult to read. It's not the kind of thing you just digest, but it's worth reading. Then obviously there's anything by Margot Anand, who brought Tantra to Europe and to the West and made it more accessible. Personally, I'm not so keen on her focus, but why not? It gives more of a historical perspective than anything else. However, the book I really would recommend from a content and practical side is Urban Tantra by Barbara Carrellas. She's lived through the wild years in New York and has found Tantra and has practiced it for a long time and has practiced it also in diverse settings. So that there are combinations. Tantra works well with things like BDSM. It works well with all kinds of swinger clubs. It fits well into the image of quite a lot of different movements. And without spoiling the content, I think Barbara has done them all. So there's a lot of very interesting content. But why I recommend the book is mainly because it also has a lot of information on practice. So it's not just spiritual like Osho would talk, or very practical, heteronormative that Margot Anand would do, but Barbara is able to bring the exercises into a purely content format. So you get step-by-step instructions what to do. That doesn't mean you're able to do it, but you get the instructions very clearly. And it's all kinds of exercises. It's exercises for just the breath, for one person, for couples of all denominations. There's a bit in the book that is just for the lady parts, and there's a bit in the book that's just for the gentleman parts, and it all rounds together, and she's able to write it in a digestible form. So you can easily read through it and take inspiration and just try things. And I think that's absolutely worth reading.
If you could meet anybody, dead or alive, that you could have a conversation with, who would you choose and what would be the reason you choose that person?
That old chestnut again. I'm always having trouble with that one. I don't really have anybody in mind specifically. I've always thought somebody important in science, Einstein or Watson Crick or that kind of people, Marie Curie, or because I used to be, or I'm still a very brainy person, but that was the main focus of my life. Anything that is square.
Yeah.
Einstein isn't quite square, but hey, with that hair you can't be square. But I think with the switch and the shift I've gone through, I'm more looking at thinkers, The one that came up is Gandhi, but Gandhi is kind of last year for me as well. I've read a lot on him, and I've dealt with him in my way. Philosophers, maybe. I'm also interested in dance, but not necessarily performers. I'm more interested in composers or choreographers, but nobody specific comes to mind. There are lots of them. There's one person, one dancer and one choreographer I'd probably like to meet, and he's alive. It's Akram Khan.
It's interesting that we talked about opening up your senses, and that this goes more than the
dance
and the intellectual realm.
Yeah. And he is very intellectual.
Okay, there's like a little bit of.
I've actually, the weird thing is, I've seen some of his work in Brighton, where I live now, and I was fascinated by it. It was a brilliant show, and then I read up on him, and I realized that I've actually seen a show he did in Ghent. In the Beiloke many years ago, when he wasn't as famous as he is now. So, and I was fascinated by his work then already. So I think that would be a person I'd like to meet.
Is there
one of many?
Yeah. Is there if you could see your dad again, would there be any kind of conversation or something you still would like to say to him?
Well, funny you should ask. I had an experience during one of my diploma exercises where I went to a place that I actually talked to my dad. And the surprising thing was that the only thing I really wanted to tell him and thank him for is his kindness. That he always was a kind person. And it's funny, really, because that is a classic question that you often get if you have kids. Do you want them to be successful, or do you want them to be kind? And in my case, the question is, the answer is simple. I want them to be kind. And my dad was very kind. He always was kind. I can't remember any time that he wasn't. Not just to me, but to anybody else. And at the time, I believe that might have been interpreted as soft and weak. But from my point of view now, I think it's the best gift you can give anyone, being kind. Just being kind and being aware of someone else's needs. It's all you can really hope for. From both sides. Being the person who provides that, and also being the person who's being taken care of when they need it. Can't think of anything better.
If I talk about a meaningful and fulfilling life, what does a meaningful, fulfilling life mean to you?
Helping others. Simple as that. I think I'm following in my dad's footsteps now, but yeah. Helping. And just helping, not necessarily making it known that you do that. It's being kind and helping people to cope with whatever life throws at them.
Beautiful, obviously, your own journey with being kind to yourself, being kind to other people, organizing your life, helping other people organize their life, sort yourself out, help people sort other people out. You see that there's a link, and even a family link. So it's beautiful, the work you're doing, both personally and both with other people. If people want to find out more about the work you do with decluttering and future things you want to do with tantra, where can they check you out and get in contact with you?
Well, Decluttering, simple enough. I've got a website, and I'm sure you'll mention the address in the text below the video. I'm on Twitter, same thing.
Cluttermeister.
Yeah, it's cluttermeister.co.uk. and Twitter is @Cluttermeister. Obviously on Facebook. So find my name, Tilo Flache or Cluttermeister, and you'll get in touch with me. As for Tantra, it's a bit more difficult because I want to, at this point, I don't think Tantra and decluttering, while spiritually connected, on a purely marketing level, it doesn't quite connect because the associations are too different. And I don't want to, and now we're talking shop, I don't want to alienate my customers because they might not be too thrilled about mixing those things together, and they might not be open to either of them. I don't believe somebody who signs up for Tantra is necessarily interested in decluttering, but and the other way around. So I'm going to keep those separate, and I haven't started my practice yet, so that is still very much out in the open. But when the time comes, I will definitely market myself over Facebook. So there will be a specific page for it, and there might be a website, which then again would be accessible through Facebook. So sign up to get in touch with me, like my page, and
get in touch, and maybe the touch will also be present with the tantra.
Maybe the touch will come to you.
The tantra workshops. Thanks for being so kind to making the time to have a conversation with me. Wish you all the best with helping people's life and contributing to their happiness. Thanks so much.
Same for you. Thank you for having me.
Hey, it's Filip from Habit Bootcamps, and I help entrepreneurs and coaches achieve more in less time by boosting their productivity and sales. If you would like to get on a free consultation call with me, you can go to habitbootcamps.com/free productivity consultation or habitbootcamps.com/free sales consultation. And if you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and check out my Habit Bootcamps YouTube channel and Facebook group for some more awesome content.